Welcome to Breaking Down the Page. This is Brooke Hennon here to talk with you about some fictional structures in your novels or short stories, but really kind of particularly looking about how I've kind of taken some of these ideas and decided to be playing with them very recently this last week in my writing. So we're going to be looking at cover stories, chapter epigraphs, and chapter chasers. We will go through those one at a time, but first, a shout out to my boy Anthony, who was in Japan, and he bought me this Dr. Stone little standalone figurine to stand like that. It's going to go on my shelf behind me. I don't want to distract myself too much, so just setting that to the side, but you will see it in the back in the future. Thank you, Anthony. And we're going to start with Art Spiegelman. I have my copy of Mouse here, but I have met him. I actually interviewed him, so you can see my name here. I chatted with him when he visited Columbia College Chicago. I will add, my name was misspelled on the cover. Bummer. It's that's just how it's going to be, right? So we're going to talk about cover pages. Cover pages are what you can think of as a graphic novel or comic book version of chapter epigraphs. So we're going to open up here. I got some markers. And more or less what, the difference here from what you would say is if you're going to have an issue of a comic book and a bunch of comics just fell, the cover of the comic is going to have to do with what happens inside that particular issue. So we have Uncanny 115, Uncanny 116, which Rochelle and I were just watching some of these kind of episodes adapted into the cartoon from the 90s of the X-Men. What else fell? We have a Zatanna comic. So it's, you get the expectation of what's going to happen in this issue. So that's how they're sold. We got Shadowcat, I think, having issues in the Danger Room, and Uncanny 168. And we get a little bit of that here, but very more abstract with Chapter 6 here of Mousetrap, as what's actually happening in the events, or, that's more of a metaphor, as this is, if you're not familiar with Mouse, it's based on Art Spiegelman's father's stories of being sent to Auschwitz. Highly recommend it. Amazing book. He created this in the 70s. One of the first pieces of fiction dealing with Holocaust stories. And then we have this other great chapter cover page where, yes, this is setting the expectation of what to see in the story, but it's separate from the actual artwork that would be on the front of a chapter, where this is kind of like the section of the book beginning. So it's not the best representation of what I want, but it is still set aside a little bit different than simply the cover of a comic book. Whereas One Piece, and I just don't know if other books do this in quite the same way, but One Piece, let's set this over here, does it superbly. So I'm on Viz here. One Piece will start a chapter, and we have chapter 1063, My Only Family. And then the actual, so that's the chapter title, and then we have a title here for what's happening on the page. We got Derma 66 an Emotionless Excursion, Volume 21, Pudding's Been Abducted. And we have Cracker here, who has been frozen, and I'm totally blanking. I want to call her Branch. That's what Luffy calls her. I'm totally blanking on her name. And we have Pudding up here. And then you skip through, and you get the regular chapter where the Straw Hats are over on a completely different island. And all we get from the chapter pages, we get an entirely separate story. And so we can go to a different chapter. Let's go to the next one. What happens so every week you just get an update on the story. Jump to the end of the chapter, middle of the chapter. And now we're seeing Pudding. So this is 1 week later. This is published weekly. We have Pudding on a boat, Germa 66 on Emotionless Excursion, which is the title of these larger stories. Blackbeard Pirates, Kuzan, and Augur. It's volume 22. Spoilers if you're reading One Piece. Things happen. There's characters. Stuff happens. And so what I pulled up here is One Piece is now 1,080 chapters. So this is a few chapters ago. But since the beginning, what you get in One Piece is you will get the cover stories here. So we have a Buggy cover story. You either get cover stories or Oda will take submissions for fan art. And with the fan art, it might be one guy that's known as like Lotus Skywalker or something like that. There's some guy that or kid that continually gets stuff in. It's like Luffy feeding pigeons and just characters doing weird stuff. And then we'll have a break, and then we'll have 20 issues, 30, maybe 50 issues of cover stories. So here, the very first opening section of One Piece, Buggy here, the clown, his body can be chopped up. He has the chop fruit, and he doesn't die. His torso and legs got just like shot somewhere else, and so he's got feet, arms, and head. And so here's chapter 35. We get the beginning of cover page series, The Adventures of Buggy's Pirate Fleet. Then we get the next chapter. So 1 week later, we get Moji and Kabaji. They're two of his clown pirate people. They are running away from the village that they had fought. Now we got Buggy's adventure. He's chasing around this duck. We get him being chased by the duck's parent. So this is the Buggy one. And there's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, probably 15 now, 14 or 15. We have another one with Colby and Helmeppo. We saw them back in the first few chapters. And so while we get Luffy and Black is what's happening in the actual chapter here, we get to set aside time and just say, what's happening elsewhere in the world? And while these are kind of good guys, we start getting their development as characters, and particularly for the first two with Buggy. In the anime, they eventually took the Buggy cover stories and turned them into 1 or 2 episodes. They took the Colby Helmeppo ones and turned them into 1 or 2 episodes. They have not done that with any other cover story since. And there's definitely moments where in chapters we'll bounce around the world and just get clips of what's happening, or we might stick somewhere for a little bit longer in interrupting what's happening with the Straw Hats. But here, it just gives Oda a chance to explore an ongoing narrative outside of the regular story. Whereas in American comic books, you'd say, oh, we have X-Men, and then we have Uncanny X-Men, and the stories are kind of running within the kind of the same timeline, but not entirely in the same timeline. Where eventually it's like Marvel DC like to have their big events where it's like, oh no, now like the Justice League, Superman, and all these things have tie-ins. Just big events going on. And those can be a lot of fun, and sometimes you're fatigued like I got, and you decide it's time to check out. So we have another one. This is a villain in, not the main villain, but like a second-hand man in the Syrup Village arc. And we follow what happens with him. And so it's very much like Oda's is just kind of grabbing characters, and he's just like, what happens next with them? As opposed to, like, especially if you look at Marvel movies, like X-Men movies, Rochelle and I just watched a bunch of them, and it's like, they just kind of kill a lot of the bad guys. Magneto, like, continues, but in a lot of superhero movies, that's one of the issues that they have is how do you deal with bad guys? What happens next? Amazingly, in the 3rd episode of the X-Men animated series, Magneto is attacking a base and he launches some missiles. The X-Men have to deal with the missiles. Magneto just leaves. Like, Magneto like picked them up, dropped them from the air. They barely survive, and he just walks away. He just flies away, no problem, and he's able to then be a continuing character in the story. We have over here the jailbreak of an Hachi, the octopus man. He just jumps off the boat and he can survive in the water because he's a fishman. We have Wapple. another main villain from the Drum Island arc. We see what happens with him. He later, and so the beauty here is later down the line, we run into all these characters again, or at least most of them. And it's like, oh, we know what they've been up to. If you watch the anime, you got no idea. But if you're reading the comic, you're like, oh, that's why Oda's telling us to do things. He ate a bench, turns into a bench. He eats things and turns into the things he eats, more or less. We get Ace. He's a main character in One Piece. He just kind of shows up, and if you're not reading the comic, you have no idea how much screen time he's had. This other random dude, I can't think of his name, falls from the sky. Oh, Gadatsu. It's been a while since I read his story. Where's the one where we get Enru's? His seems shorter. Get villains from the next arc. All right, here we go. This is one of the most significant cover stories in One Piece because, spoilers, if you haven't been past chapter 428, we get short-term concentrated cover series number 9 to the very Verth. And this is the arc Maxim, which is an arc created by a character named Eneru or Enel. And he is flying to the moon. And he lands on the moon. He's wandering around the moon. And he ends up finding people or little creatures on the moon, like robots on the moon. And One Piece fans are just like, how does this fit into the story and when is he coming back? And so there's as much hype for some of these cover stories, and for a lot of the cover stories, there's a lot of hype over what's happening, depending on who we're following. Where just the community, as they're reading weekly, gets really pumped up about it. I've often wondered, what does the comic book version or what does the novel version of this look like? How do you put this into a book, right? So I didn't realize this until because I listened to the audiobook for this. This is Brandon Sanderson's The Hero of Ages, which he autographed for me. I met him. And you're supposed to write down like, oh, to the best of, happy birthday. And I asked him, I was like, can you please please join my writers group? And he looks up at me and he says, I'll only write it if it's not true. And I was just like, yes, right, not true. So he did write that in my book. There's his signature. In spirit. In spirit, I'm joining his writers group. Oh yeah, here's the little tab saying the short greeting. So for me, I listened to the book, and there's the chapter epigraphs that I always thought were at the end of the chapters. They're actually at the beginning. So at the chapter 1, we get, I am, unfortunately, the hero of ages. And then we go into the chapter. So we get this little aside setting up what's happening in the... And then we jump to the next, chapter 2. Holding the power did strange things to my mind. In just a few moments, I became familiar with the power itself, with its history and with the ways it might be used. Yet, this knowledge was different from experience or even ability to use that power. For instance, I knew how to move a planet in the sky, yet I didn't know where to place it so that it wouldn't be too close or too far from the sun. So listening to this, this would be at the end of chapters, and then they would say chapter 2. I had no idea it was visually at the beginning. And if you read the first book, it is like very minor spoilers. The first book, you're getting excerpts from a journal, which then, of course, if you be like, why are we getting this? The reason why would be because someone is reading the journal later in the book. But Sanderson, or the storyteller here, wants to convey the information from the journal to the reader so they don't just get an info dump later in the story whenever they actually have access to the journal. So there is that question. Who is writing this? What is the purpose? Things can be very straightforward or misleading from the storytelling perspective. Chapter 23. During the days of Kelsier's original plan, I remember how much he confused us all with his mysterious 11th metal. So even here, this is laying the groundwork of Kelsier's a character in the first book. He's an ongoing character. let's say that. That this has to be someone that knows Kelsier. Just by what's considered. The question is, what character is it that we're following? Chapter 24. I now believe that Kelsier's stories, legends, and prophecies about the 11th metal were fabricated by Ruin. Kelsier was looking for a way to kill the Lord Ruler, and Ruin, even subtle, provided a way. So there. We all have permission now to add stuff at the beginning of our stories. What I also want to talk about is chasers. So here we got Wonderful Watchmen by Alan Moore. I was thinking about this copy. I bought this in 2004 or spring of 2005 when I was at Kentucky Christian University, and I'm like, this I can see the yellowness of the pages. With V for Vendetta, I had to buy 2 copies because one fell apart, and I bought another copy when I was in Europe because I was like, I need to read this after getting stuck at Heathrow Airport, where they continually say unattended packages will be taken and destroyed. There's very something authoritarian of driving on the airport with the barbed wire everywhere, not being able to have freedom to move around. So at the end of the chapters of Watchmen, we have these larger story excerpts from different places, from different sources in the world of Watchmen. For me, when I was reading it, I just want to get through the story the first time I read this, and I was just like, forget this. I don't care, because this is from Under the Hood. We present here excerpts from Hollis Mason's autobiography, Under the Hood, leading up to the time when he became the masked adventurer Night Owl, reprinted with permission of the author. And Hollis Mason, I believe, is the first Night Owl, where we're mostly following the second Night Owl. So this is his book that he wrote about the background of why did villains started wearing masks, so the superheroes started wearing masks, who were the first vigilantes, how did this all come about? So we get just lore. It's I can't necessarily say a lore dump. Being that it's a comic, it's a bit more because this is in prose, but we're just getting world building at the end of the first chapter. It ends with, reportage on his second instance was more detailed. A supermarket stick-up had been prevented thanks to the intervention of a tall man built like a wrestler, who wore a black hood and cape and also wore a noose around his neck. This extraordinary being had crashed in through the window of the supermarket while the robbery was in progress and attacked the man responsible with such intensity. It goes on. Reading and rereading the news item, I knew that I had to be the second. I'd found my vocation. So that's where he decides, I want to be a superhero. Also, each chapter, we get the nuclear clock is getting closer to midnight. So then we get the cover story that kind of gives us frame of reference what's going to happen in the issue. This would have been printed on the cover of the actual comic, and some graphic novels add all the covers at the end when they're collected. So the next several chapters, chapters 1 through 4, all feature stories from Hollis Mason's book Under the Hood. And here we switch it up where we get Dr. Manhattan, Superpowers and Superpowers by Professor Milton Glass. And then we get this thing that's written by Milton Glass from this excerpt of his book that he wrote, or the essay. We are all of us living in the shadow of Manhattan. The clock is getting closer. So just more world building. We then get to one of the cool things in Watchmen is Alan Moore addresses. Sorry, the camera's not focusing. I don't know what's happening. Oh well. You can get the gist of it. You don't need to read the text. There is no pirate fiction in comic books in the history of comics. We had westerns, we had romance, we have superheroes, but there's never pirate comics. So he actually has a kid reading pirate comics, and we're getting those pirate comics. There we go. Thank you, camera. So we're getting that interspersed with actual events that are happening here, and this kid is reading the pirate comics. So then at the end of the chapter, we get a man of 15 dead men's chest. A man on 15 dead men's chest. We get a conversation, a discussion about the guy that makes the comic books and building out this world, and I think that's where it kind of builds out some of that lore. Throughout the story, Rorschach, this last chapter has to do with Rorschach having been arrested. This is his rap sheet, or his rap sheet with kind of psychological details as he's going through counseling at the moment. So confidential, and it's actually presented like it's a piece of paper on a desk. We get Blood from the Shoulders of Pallas, following his text reprinted from the Journal of the American Ornithological Society. It's going to talk about owls and other stuff like that. The clock is closer. There's a magazine called The New Frontiersman. We get the cover, so it's like we're actually just getting that magazine Thursday, October 31st, 1985. Another newspaper, different newspaper. We get a internal memo from Veet Marketing and Development. That is Ozymandias's company. Get some pages about them and their products and background. And then we get an interview with Veet, Adrian Veet, in these last few pages, talking about who he was. So I've always wondered, like, how do you do this in prose? And there's that question of, do you simply present it as, like, I do a printed cover page at the end or a cover page at the beginning? How do you go about trying to play with these mediums? Where, and Brandon Sanderson, I really loved when I was listening to the books, getting those asides, it's something that if you were getting this in a serial manner, you have some fun with just getting that little bit. And as I've been working on this new writing project, I don't really have a name, I just call it the Epicurean. I've been using Scrivener, so a little preview for Scrivener. Just I love this. It shows my word count up here and has little markers for how much I'm writing. I'm 636 out of 2,500 words for the day, 17,375 out of 55,000 words. The challenge is from April 1st to May 5th doing 55,000 words, and I'm ahead of schedule, thankfully. So over here on the left, we get the breakdown where I have my chapter 1 and the subsections, and so very kind of simple. Actually, I'll go to where it was yesterday I really got into this. And so I get into the end of chapter 7 involves setting up kind of like a superhero vigilante versus superpowered police conflict. Earlier in the chapter, Trent gives a phone call to some characters that are also vigilantes that we've never seen more or less on camera. They've not been mentioned until now. So I have the question then, how do I introduce them showing up and interrupting a fight and kind of saving Trent and Hannah's and Yami's butts, so to speak, if assuming they can do that? But at least they show up in the middle of a fight. How do I introduce them in the middle of a fight without having to just like hit the brakes and pause the plot and then introduce the what do they look like? Because if this was a comic book and all of a sudden you see like a Star Spangled Person show up, it's not you don't know who Captain America is, but all of a sudden Captain America shows up and you're just like, who's this dude? It's obviously a superhero based on how he's dressed. I want to know more. But in a book, you can't really do it. If I give someone's name, I need to ground the character at least visually more for the audience, since I don't want to pause and say like, what is he wearing? What are they wearing? And so as a writer, you have to work your way around this. What are your characters wearing? How do you but there is this caveat of it only matters if it's incredibly relevant to the story. An example of that I always give to people. They're when teaching fifth and sixth graders, or really any age, we have the example of a published story from a fifth grader where she talks about she's up in the Sears Tower in Chicago, and a giant ice storm comes through and freezes the city, and there is a ice slide going from the top of the Sears Tower all the way down to Lake Michigan. In the story, she says something along the lines of, "So I break the window and then I ride the ice slide down." I'll ask you this question. When I say she broke the window, how do you picture her breaking the window? How she does it doesn't necessarily matter. As far as the thing that she does, it's only important that the window breaks. Let's say she breaks the window and hurt her fist in the process. We then have a sense that, if we know that she hurt her fist, she must have used it to break the window. But I like to ask students that, and some will say, like, I pictured her picking up a chair. I pictured her kicking it. I picture her running through it or doing anything. It doesn't necessarily matter how she broke the window unless there's a consequence relative to how she broke the window. So there's this issue of making sure the audience is picturing what they need to picture, and you need space for the imagination to fill in the gaps. If you look back at vaudeville theater back in the 20s and 30s, where a lot of times the theaters had no money, you would often get a bench, and you just put a bench on the stage, and then like a light post, and it's like, oh, someone's sitting in the park. Or when I was at Guerrilla Theater, or whatever it was called, up in Wicker Park several years ago, I went to a show, and they had a bunch of people sitting in chairs in rows, and my imagination filled in that they were either on a bus or they were on a train, as people were getting off, and they're making like sounds, like the bus brakes or the doors are opening. And you want to have this balance of making sure audience can picture things clearly, but that their imagination also fill in the gaps and can have fun and has room to play. That is where the magic of comic books happen, is in the gutters here, between, well, right here, we're seeing a very clear progression of him turning away, and Dave Gibbons gives us a very clear track. If we're going to get into kind of a little bit later, where we're getting different events that are happening that they're observing, we get her and they're kind of fooling around here, and we get these examples of what's happening outside and versus what's on the television. Our mind is then kind of filling in the gaps in these gutters in between the panels, where most of the time you like to see the big punches. But sometimes, and I saw a video the other day where a lot of the times in anime, manga, we actually see the impact of a punch. Where in a lot of Western stuff, like here, we don't see him actually drop the electrical wire into the water that's on the ground. Versus in anime, it may be more likely that we'd actually see it hitting the ground there, or like getting a small panel of it sparking. Here, we don't actually get the fighting, we just get him leaving the person behind and walking away, because Rorschach is awesome. But where are you leaving space for your readers to use their imaginations, and where are you as readers, where you ever think about where you're using it in your imaginations and how much you're filling in the details of the story? So getting back to my writing here, we got Yami, Hannah, and Trent end up in a grassy lot that's empty in the McKinley Park neighborhood of Chicago, and they get surrounded by police, and then these officers with this various Hebrew characters on their chests all kind of drop down and are going to attack them. But I'm like, man, I really want Adrian and Teresa to show up, but I need to give a little bit more leading time for the audience to know that they're on their way. Or at least I had a very particular picture of Adrian carrying his girlfriend in his arms, because he can run super fast and she can fly, but she can't fly fast enough to get where they need to go. So they need to get several miles to go help out Trent. And that's where I decided, what if I actually try putting chasers at the end of chapters? So right at the end of the chapter, we're done with our regular characters, and now we're going to follow up what's happened with other people. So the first one I wrote, I believe the first one I wrote was here. At least I got it set up. Where, what was that call about? Teresa asked. She was sitting at the dining table near the kitchen in Adrian's one-bedroom apartment. Teresa was generally in playing housewife mode, even though they were dating. At least that's where her mind was. I haven't edited this yet. Where her mind was, even as though she'd taken the time at home to wash and curl her blonde, shoulder-length hair. She'd put on her makeup as well, even though they weren't planning to go out, and she'd put on her favorite black floral sundress. Backless. Well, I was like, black floral sundress. There, you pictured. We all pictured the wrong thing. Backless floral sundress. So while she was in the mindset of playing future wife, she was still presenting herself to be as attractive as she could, compared to her mother, a wife of 20 plus years, who was very subdued when presenting herself if she wasn't planning to go anywhere for the day. Adrian had gotten up and walked off away for the call, which he'd had on speaker as per usual. He was wearing khaki shorts and a sports branded t-shirt. His face felt puffy for an unknown reason, and his hair was a little frizzy from the humidity because he hadn't taken the time to gel it. I don't know. He just hung up. Adrian answered. Sorry, I get to see the actual editing process here. And then we get them putting on their suits, their superhero suits. We get to view that at the end, and we get the setup. So at the end of this chapter, we have both, and the goal I'm trying to hit is, this is actually, I didn't realize this is 1,000 words. I tried to in the previous chapters for just these chapter chasers to be like around 500 words. This is a little bit longer, but I would say it falls clearly within the timeline of this chapter, rather than, I don't necessarily want to make sub chapters for just Adrian. Like in Game of Thrones, that's another, rather than kind of doing the same stuff with the chapter chasers or epigraphs. George R. R. Martin goes from like, here's Sansa, here's Tyrion, here's Jaime, here's whichever character, Sam, here's Jon Snow. So he doesn't really have to do the stuff beginning or end of chapters, because it's like we just jump into the next character for an entire chapter. And then I was like, I need to do something for each of these. And because part of the story is that Yami, main character, is jumping through different realities, and he's trying to figure out why he's doing that, what is his purpose. And he's very confused at the beginning of the story, and he's figuring stuff out. The first chapter is just like him going to do his laundry, which is, the initial story I came up with was like probably 15 years ago, and I was like, what if there's a dude named the Epicurean and I was thinking literally about Watchmen, the character called the Comedian in Watchmen, and the difference between like romantic verse, epics, tragedies, and comedies. What are the larger story archetypes there? And I was like, the Epicurean, what if there's a superhero whose power is to, he just goes to do normal stuff, like go do laundry, and all of a sudden he just falls between dimensions and ends up like starting a revolution and saving like a princess, or he defeats the dragon, overthrows the evil empire, becomes Aragorn in Lord of the Rings. And then he just he falls back through reality to doing his laundry. And so I was like, you know what? We just went to the laundromat the other day. That sounds like a great place to start. And so we get him taking out the trash, decides to go do his laundry. We got just 500 words doing the trash. Then we takes the bus of laundry, another 500 words. So then we're like 10 pages in, and all of a sudden, we get a guy comes up and like slaps his arm with something. He says, now go, they're waiting for you. The elderly man took hold of Yami's forearm, waved a pattern in the air with his other arm. Yami felt a searing sensation on his arm, looked down at it, and when he looked up, he was standing before a host of people, and he just gets teleported. And I was like, man, first chapter, where do I need to be a little bit creative, figure out who's here, like what I want to set it up in the first chapter to do these chasers. So I sat around a little bit yesterday and was thinking through it, went like walked around the apartment. I didn't do anything productive like dishes, though my wife probably would have preferred that. And I decided, you know what? When I was at the laundromat, there's the wonderful like laundry shop owner or manager was walking around checking the lint in the dryers, sweeping up the floor here and there. Looks like she's in her 50s or 60s, not entirely sure. And I was like, you know what? What does she do when people just leave their laundry? And decided to explore a character kind of based off her. And so we got Maurice Perlman, couldn't keep her eyes off the clock. She wandered the laundromat, checking the lint filters and sweeping the floor when needed. They're my initial thoughts. The vibration of the machines were a comfortable buzz. When she had first invested in their business, she couldn't stand the vibrational noise of the washer. It was as though she could feel it, even at home hours after leaving the washers and dryers behind. It seemed like now, in her 50s, Maurice's body was addicted to movement of the machines. At the beach in Florida for their second anniversary, she could feel the absence on the beach, much to her husband's denial. Robbie, she told him while lying in a red beach chair, I can feel it in my bones. Yesterday I was feeling a little off, but today my bones ache. It had to be the travel, hun. You don't feel it? Nah, I don't, but maybe because I'm not there every day like you are. We get into that she runs the stuff and he has other jobs that he performs. So it's a business that they own. And then I just develop that story, and I'm like, she ends up, um, she passed. So then we kind of go back to modern day. She passed by two triple washers with wet clothes ready to be transferred to the dryer. Where is that Asian boy? She said and eyed the larger room. Yami. He was gone. She shrugged and walked down the aisle lined with washers. She grabbed a metal cart and unloaded Yami's clothes. She rolled them to a dryer, loaded them, and used her card to start the drying process. Do I end up having even more from? And then I even have a follow up, which is shorter in the next chapter. Maurice couldn't remember Yami ever leaving the laundromat. Usually she noticed when people stepped out. She knew most of her clientele. Some people would step out to their cars to talk on their phones. Others would get the donuts, ice cream, or pizza from the shops in the market. There was always that white boy who'd go to the wing place and bring back an aluminum foil pan of chicken and fries. That's a self-insert for me. With Yami, no, because I'm the only one that like brings an entire meal into the laundromat. It's like a giant, like this long tin. With Yami nowhere in sight, she fetched one of the metal carts and went to his dried clothes. She transported them to a folding table. She worked her way through the clothes, but the boy never returned. She put them into an orange laundry bag and added them to a rainbow of laundry bags. Oh, I meant to say like in the storage room. So this is me just like trying to figure this out. Testing. This is the first time first time sharing this with anyone. Or really, I read a little bit of this story to a friend named Moni last night after we played some Diablo 2. So we go back to Adrian and Teresa. We got them. We know that they're. He jumped over. We get a second section. Nope, this is just. He jumped over the 18th Street intersection to avoid the cars passing laterally in front of him. Oh, like we had do set up. When he passed the 17th, which is the northern side of the 1st District Police Station, he turned and saw a street that was usually lined with police cars and SUVs was completely vacant. He took a deep breath through his nose and pressed on, putting together potential pieces of why Trent had called him in such a spastic way. He jumped over the 18th Street intersection to avoid the cars passing laterally in front of him. He landed with minor skidding and took the right on Archer and opened up his speed. The street was 4 to 5 lanes across depending on turn lanes near intersections. He remembered it being roughly 3.5 miles down Archer to Western. If the travel conditions were that of an airfield, he could clear the distance in seconds, and if you weren't carrying a passenger. Teresa's suit wasn't made for extreme wind resistance like Adrian's. No, double the speed of traffic was as usual, so not to kill himself or cause traffic accidents. He'd done more than enough of that in his rookie days. He figured he could make it to Trent's in 5 minutes or less. So at the end of that chapter, we now see where they're at, and I'm kind of setting up the timeline of we can expect 5 minutes, and this would have happened a few minutes ago, like directly after the phone call. We know that several minutes have passed since the phone call, whereas earlier, we have a guy named Gary who ran into Yami when he showed up on this world. Where are we back in Chicago? At the end of it, and so when I was in the process of writing, Trenton and Han ended up taking Yami to their house. They picked Yami up, and mass transit went back to the train because he'd first met Yami on the train, and they got off and went to like a place to eat. So then I'm writing the story, a few thousand words in, and I end up having Gary. I'm like, I need to have the police show up somehow. I need to have law enforcement. I want some kind of superpowered law enforcement show up to fight my superpowered vigilantes. Like, of course, that's why I write this stuff, to entertain myself with people punching each other. And I just have Trent gets a call from Gary, and Gary gives him very limited information. So what's up, Gary? Something's up and it's big. What is it? The police scanners are going nuts with some code I've never heard of, and they're calling them to Bashta Waboika Park. That's I don't know how to pronounce Potawatomi. Sorry. It's like they're calling it, and I made up that. I renamed McKinley Park to this for their story reasons. It's like they're calling it all the 9th District in SWAT, because I just passed the headquarters at 35th, and from the Green Line, they're loading up for war. So the Green Line train overlooks the 35th Street station. And even before that, and that's something, if you've been to Chicago, I didn't just make that up for the book. That's, this is like, I like reading stuff in Chicago, and so if you've been around, you're gonna like be well orientated with the stuff that I write. And even before that, I wasn't really thinking about it, but I saw a ton of cops leaving the 1st District and heading down Archer to, if you're home, you need to get out of there. It says, thanks, Gary. Trent ended the call with a stern face. He walked past Hannah and Yami and went right up the stairs. He goes up to grab their costumes. So we got Gary there, and I'm like, I need to just give as little bit of, like, if you're having an emergency, how much information do you need to give over the phone? Then I realized if I did a mass transit note, the end of the previous chapter, we know where he went, and we get him actually noticing that section where he's kind of admiring. I'm getting a little bit of world building of Chicago. Buckingham Fountain is no longer Buckingham Fountain. It's now Chamonix Fountain, which is named after a Potawatomi warrior. Because in northern Illinois, just for like, why Potawatomi? Because that's regionally what Native Americans were in the Chicagoland area, some of them. But then we get at the end of it, continuing south as the train was coming near the 1st District Police Station at State and 18th, he noticed a flurry of officers heading to their various vehicles. Moments later, as they passed, he passed by Archer, he could see a fleet of police vehicles heading south down Archer towards Chinatown. Also, earlier in the book, we get that Trent is driving down Archer, but he's farther west. And so it's like, how do I kind of set up these events in order where the audience can put the stuff together, hopefully, or if you could kind of follow it on a map. And so we get his perspective of stuff happening. We know that he calls Trent and gives him information about this happening, the 1st District, and then here we had Teresa and got started to slow to figure out how much he needed to compensate for her weight. He'd never picked her up and carried her before while using the speed, nor had he really ever carried someone so far using his powers before. He wasn't a blur by any means. He ran to the end of the alley on Roosevelt, then turned left on Wabash once the light was green. He shifted over to State Street at 16th with the plan of taking Archer south. He gently passed by the cars going should be the speed limit of 30 miles per hour. He could run a roughly comfortable 60 on smaller streets. When he passed 17th, which is the northern side of the 1st District Police Station, he turned and saw a street that was usually lined with police cars and SUVs. And we kind of read through the next section, and then we get the breakdown that he's running down towards Western, where Trent is. So there's my fun application of what I've been up to. I've been thinking about this for 5-6 years, since whenever I started reading One Piece, probably. And that was chapter around 567 during Dressrosa. The first chapter may have been the one where the Usopp and Robin were trapped by the little mini people. I can't think of what they're called. Little fairies. They're like tied to the ground and stuff because of Leopold or Leo. But yeah, there we go. Thank you for watching my intro about chapter structures, talking about cover pages, epigraphs, and chasers. Have a terrific day. Hope you enjoyed. Like and subscribe. That'd always be helpful. Share it with your friends. Be like, look at this idiot on the internet trying to talk about things. Oh my gosh. Later.